I'm gonna do a quick intro and do the same little shares that I did last time, just so people are familiar with what we got going on. So, welcome everybody once again to an awesome talk from Stephanie Thomas, our renowned speaker guest here. So, this is hosted by Integrative Care Collective, or the ICC. I want to share a couple of quick, just need to know things just to get everybody acquainted. So I'll just share my screen here really quick. And there's my announcement email, which you don't need to see. Okay. So just so you know, we are sponsored by Perspectives Health. That allows us to do events such as this, keep the costs covered, and we're very thankful to them. They are a clinical AI documentation company covering SOAP notes, DAP notes, and assessments. So they do offer a 2-week free trial to members of the ICC. So you can just reach out directly to me if you're interested in that. And their website is perspectiveshealth.ai. And then, of course, I'm always trying to get as many people as possible in our provider directory. So this allows the user to sign up on their own, create their own account, upload their own information. So here's Shannon's right here. You can just click on it, learn more, get her contact information, see if she's a good fit. There's a website right there. And then for providers, it does track whenever these buttons are clicked, so you can keep an eye on how much business we're actually sending you. It is $5 a month just to cover kind of some of the costs that come with hosting it, but we do offer a 3-month free trial with the code sponsored. Again, thanks to Perspectives Health for sponsoring. And then without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Stephanie. So Stephanie previously was a pharmacist and left that career path to pursue food as medicine. She's extremely knowledgeable about nutrition and all related things, as well as many other topics. So I am always awestruck by her talks. So very excited for another great one. And that's all I got. So I'll hand it over to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you, Cole. Your intros are always so flattering, so I appreciate that. Um, I'll share my screen in a second here. Hi, Ellis. But I want to just kind of briefly say a few things about who I am. I know those who are live with me here have already heard this, but as Cole said, I'm a former pharmacist, and that experience working in the field for 6 years in the retail setting. Um, Taught me a lot, and I kind of credit the experience for the iconoclast that I have become. And I have taken to the joke now that I am a former pharmacist and I'm only interested now in dispensing red pills. And so this is kind of where I want to take us today. Let me go ahead and share my screen here so we can get that part going. Okay, yeah. So the untold story of modern medicine is what we're going to be chatting about today. Um, and I really enjoy speaking about this topic because, for me at least, I feel like it gives a lot of clarity as to why our healthcare system functions the way that it does. Which, frankly, it's a pretty broken system. Obviously, it's a for-profit model, which is replete with all sorts of issues just inherently there. But I also consider it to be kind of inhumane, and it is getting worse. And so this narrative that I'm going to share will shed a lot of light on how we ended up where we are. And it's not a secret narrative. It's an untold story, but it's not really all that fringe, except for the fact that a lot of people haven't heard it. And it's not really, disputed. It is a well documented, factual history. Excuse me. And it's basically been kind of hiding in plain sight. And I believe, from my perspective, it makes sense why it's been absent from public discourse, and certainly why it's not a story that is taught in people who are studying to be medical professionals. Because, as I think you will see, it is a story that doesn't really cast our healthcare system in a particularly positive light. But, again, that said, it explains a lot. So, without further ado, I'm going to just jump right into this because there's a lot that I want to cover. Oh, and first, I want to mention that the first part of this talk will be focused on this story, which is frankly a little bit on the dark side. But I don't like to lead people into the dark and leave them there. So the second half of this talk will be a discussion of some like heartening things that are kind of unfolding in terms of a potential paradigm shift, which I think we desperately need when it comes to healthcare and medicine in this country. So I want to start by sort of panning out and framing this talk by looking at the power of stories. So I want to explore a little bit how cultural myths and stories play a really profound role in shaping the way that we perceive and inhabit the world and our lives. So, when I'm talking about myths in this context, I'm referring to the web of assumptions that are collectively held by a culture about the nature of reality. So, these cultural myths are ultimately attempting to answer the really big questions in life: who we are, why we're here, where we're going, and what really matters. So these stories are very impactful and important. They play a really big role in shaping our belief systems, not just on an individual level, but of course on a collective level as well. They shape our values, our sense of identity, our ideas around what is real and what is possible, so our perceived limits, what we're capable of. And I think really relevant to this talk about the medical system, they also shape our consent, so the things that we're willing to say yes to. So these stories are obviously really powerful, but it's important and interesting to note that they are not absolute truths. They are rather interpretations bestowed upon us by other human beings, and they're essentially just attempts at, interpretations of understanding the nature of life and the world. And so, even though they're not absolute truths, they are certainly presented to us as if they were, and so they are therefore often accepted without question. We're born into them from, a very young age. This is the story that we're told. This is who you are. This is how the world works. And so these cultural myths play an important role in terms of granting us a sense of cultural meaning, again, at the individual and the collective level. But at the same time, they act as invisible barriers that limit our imagination. And I think you could argue that they ultimately limit our human potential. So, if we want to go a little bit deeper into this exploration of cultural myths, we can ask, oops, let me back up. I missed this piece. So, I want to talk about some of the foundational myths that kind of undergird the modern Western worldview. And so, among them are the myth of materialism, which is this story that only physical matter is real. The myth of objectivity tells us that we as humans can objectively interrogate nature and the nature of reality without projecting our own biases and worldviews, and also without actually causing an effect on that reality that we're investigating. There's the myth of progress, which tells us that it is inherently good and the ultimate purpose of humanity. Individualism tells us that we're separate from one another and from our environment. And then the myth of scientific supremacy asserts that the only legitimate way of investigating reality is through the strictly materialist application of the scientific method. Okay, so now to go deeper into this exploration, we could ask questions like, how were these cultural myths and these stories constructed? Essentially, were their architects? And I like exploring this topic through this lens because I think it helps, for me at least, to ground into the understanding that these myths and these stories were sculpted by other humans. And so they are therefore shaped by those individuals' perspectives and worldviews, not just of their creators, but also those who promote and are the purveyors of these stories. So once we understand that these cultural myths are in fact just stories, that begins to open up even more room for us to ask deeper questions like, are these stories still serving us? Or were they ever serving us for that matter? And then if not, what else is possible? What other stories could we be telling ourselves about, what is real? So, the cool thing about modern myths is that we can look back into the not too distant past and get a pretty clear understanding of who the architects were, and again, who their promoters were. And then we can also speculate with some degree of certainty, I would say, as to these individuals' values and their motives for promoting a certain worldview. So myths tend to operate in nested layers, essentially. So you have those foundational myths, like the ones that we just talked about. And then from those foundational myths spring smaller and more like field specific niche narratives. And that's kind of where we're going to go in this talk. I want to focus on the myth of modern medicine, and we're going to look at the origin story and then trace the story arc that leads us to the current, present day moment where these have become the dominant worldviews and paradigms. So, for the purposes of this talk, our story is going to begin at the point where traditional healing gave way to a more industrialized model of healthcare, like the one that we have today. So, this story really begins at the turn of the 20th century. So, before the 1900s, traditional medicine was the model of medical care that was practiced in the United States. It was practiced for millennia prior to the turn of the 20th century. And rather than the science-based approach that we have in the West here today, traditional medicine was much more of an intuitive art. So it was more focused on ancestral wisdom sharing throughout the generations and from one practitioner to another. So traditional medicine is kind of an umbrella term, and within that approach to medicine were a number of different modalities like herbalism, homeopathy, naturopathy, midwifery, and various traditional indigenous medicine practices. So even though this is a pretty broad array of different approaches to medicine, all of these modalities had a few common characteristics among them. They all relied on natural, non-toxic remedies. They prioritized holistic and preventative care. Medical education was managed by privately run medical schools. So, in contrast to the system that we have today for medical education, this was more of an apprenticeship and a mentorship model of wisdom sharing. And then I think it's really important to note that traditional medicine was really quite effective. It was aligned with nature and it was refined through trial and error and keen observation by practitioners for thousands of years. And so it was and still is a very elegant and legitimate approach to healthcare. Um, it was also widely used because it was very accessible, not just financially. People weren't going into medical debt in, the 1900s and the early 1900s. Um, and it was also really accessible geographically because most small towns and little enclaves had their own local traditional medicine practitioner and healer. So it really did a great job of serving rural, working class, and minority populations because they had easy access to this medical care, again, both geographically and financially. But then we begin to see this shift towards the more industrialized model of medicine that we have today. So this is where traditional medicine, this is the point where traditional medicine was supplanted by an entirely new conception that was more rooted in materialism of what health and medicine should look like. And so this was essentially the science-based biomedical model, which was developed in the 18th and the 19th centuries in Europe by people like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, who developed the germ theory. Rudolf Virchow developed the cell theory of disease. And so this new conception of healthcare and medicine developed in these earlier centuries in Europe, and then they were exported to the United States and arrived here in the early 1900s. So the full-scale adoption of this new model of medicine was really driven primarily by a couple of monopolists and industrialists of the time. namely John D. Rockefeller, who is that really friendly looking guy pictured here, as well as Andrew Carnegie. I'm going to focus more on John D. Rockefeller in this story because he really is the primary protagonist. And he was, of course, the oil tycoon of Standard Oil. He was also the world's first billionaire. Adjusted for inflation in today's dollars, he would have been worth about 400 billion, which would make him the richest man in the world, still today. So, as the world's first billionaire, he had unprecedented power to shape society according to his worldviews, and that is precisely what he did. I refer to him as one of the masters of the universe because the role that this man played in sculpting the trajectory of the future really can't be overstated. But we're just going to focus on the role that he played in reshaping education, medicine, and scientific research in this country. So this shift towards this new model of medicine was really made possible through two primary strategies. The first one is the Flexner Report, and the second one is philanthrocapitalism. So we'll unpack both of those, starting with the Flexner Report, which came out in 1910. And the stated purpose of this report was to examine the curriculum, facilities, and teaching standards of US and Canadian medical schools that were operating at the time. So these were, of course, traditional medical schools. The Flexner Report was funded by the Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundations. So this is where the billionaire influence comes into the scene. And this report was led by a man named Abraham Flexner, who's pictured here. As far as Abraham Flexner's credentials, he was an educational theorist. He wasn't a scientist or a medicine practitioner, just for the record. And the Flexner Report came to a couple of major conclusions upon examining these traditional medicine schools. The first thing that it noted was that these medical schools were deemed quote unquote unscientific. And then they were also criticized as being poorly regulated. So the Flexner Report also came along with some proposed solutions to these perceived issues. So to address the matter of medical schools being unscientific, the Flexner Report proposed a biomedical, allopathic, and science-based model, which was the one that came from Europe. And so, what this means essentially is that medicine was distilled down to the application of primarily one science, and that is biochemistry. Allopathic, of course, refers to the fact that this new system was focused on the suppression of symptoms rather than the holistic, integrative, and preventative approach of traditional medicine. And then, since it was a science-based model, this is where we see medicine become a purely materialist science. That is to say that if you can't see it, touch it, or measure it, then it isn't relevant in terms of the diagnosis or the treatment of a disease or a condition. So, to address the matter of these schools being poorly regulated, the Flexner Report proposed that medical education and the practice of medicine should be controlled by a central governing authority. And that was essentially to ensure conformity of practice. I want to point out that there are some assumptions being made by the Flexner Report, specifically that a decentralized system with a more holistic focus is somehow an inferior model. And I think that is definitely up for debate. I, in fact, would debate that pretty strongly myself. So there were a number of problems with the Flexner Report. Primarily, it was really wrought with some conflicts of interest, which are pretty glaring. So the Rockefeller Foundation, again, was one of the primary funders of this report. So Rockefeller had some skin in the game in terms of the conclusions of this report. And then there's the fact that Abraham Flexner, the report author, happened to be the brother of one Simon Flexner, who happened to be the first director of Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. So, yeah, it gets a little dicey from an ethical perspective here. And this is pretty classic in terms of conflicts of interest, because the findings of this report directly serve the economic interests of the primary funder as well as the family of the report author. And I find these conflicts of interest to be all the more galling when we reflect on how effectively the Flexner Report was wielded as a strategic tool to expand Rockefeller's oil monopoly. And the way that that was done essentially is that then and now, the vast majority of pharmaceuticals are derived from the chemical byproducts of oil refining. And so essentially, what Rockefeller was able to do here was turn a waste product of the oil industry into quote unquote medicine. And so for me, when I reflect on that reality, it seems pretty clear that this pharmaceutical-based approach to medicine was never truly rooted in any kind of medical wisdom, but was much more about industry profit. Industry loves nothing more than a cheap input, and yeah, oil refining waste is a pretty cheap input. So we basically got off on the wrong foot from jump because this new medical model was always rooted in um, the drive for more profit for this industry. So there were a number of significant consequences of the Flexner report, and I've kind of categorized them in two ways. So the first is it created some significant barriers to accessing medical care. And that's because as the Flexner report kind of gained traction, traditional medicine began to lose its funding, its legitimacy, and then ultimately it lost public trust. And the way that that was achieved so effectively is that there was this smear campaign that was orchestrated by the new self-anointed medical authorities that deemed that traditional medicine practices were unscientific, that they were outdated, and that they were therefore somehow unsafe after millennia of their safe and effective use. And then, of course, in this narrative, the biomedical model was elevated as the only legitimate approach to medicine. So this campaign, sort of spawned by the Flexner report, led to the closure of the majority of traditional medicine schools that were operating at the time. About three-quarters of these schools were shut down over the next 30 years. And the ones that are the individuals that were most affected by this shift were, of course, the people in those small rural minority communities. Suddenly, they didn't have access to their traditional medicine practitioners like they did before. It also created some barriers to entry for potential medicine practitioners. And that's because medical education became centralized under expensive elite universities. And in order to practice medicine in this country, you suddenly had to be properly licensed and credentialed. And so that created some very significant barriers for people who wanted to practice medicine. So what happened here, in essence, is that these new quote unquote experts were able to redefine what real medicine was. And in so doing, they created this gatekeeping system where you could only, excuse me, practice medicine if you could afford these elite universities and that education that was now required, but also you had to play by the new rules, which was that biomedical allopathic model. So this is where we see medicine shift from this really diverse and inclusive practice that was rooted in community to becoming the very exclusive and prestigious profession and industry that it is today. So the Flexner report was obviously a major catalyst in this shift away from traditional medicine and towards this new model. But philanthrocapitalism, I think, is what really helped to carry the ball across the field, so to speak. So philanthrocapitalism is essentially what it sounds like. This is where philanthropy is blended with business investment. And the way that happens more, specifically in terms of the mechanics, is that these wealthy donors use their charitable dollars to buy influence in order to advance their ideological and financial interests. So when we look at it through this more cynical lens, it doesn't seem so much like it's about generosity. It's a lot more about business strategy. And John D. Rockefeller was the pioneer of philanthrocapitalism, and he desperately needed it. It worked out quite well for him because he had a public image issue. He was seen as a ruthless monopolist. He was pretty reviled in general. And so he used philanthrocapitalism in order to whitewash his image and successfully rebranded himself from that of a ruthless monopolist to a benevolent benefactor. And it was a very successful campaign because I think to this day, a lot of people still view all of the Rockefeller foundations as being these philanthropic organizations that are doing so much good for humanity. And I'm not saying that that's not necessarily true to some extent, but this was the origin story. So the way that this works is that the donations that are made by these wealthy industrialists, these philanthro-capitalists, are always given with strings attached. It's never free money, so to speak. And so that makes philanthro-capitalism a really amazing tool for social engineering. So large conditional donations that are granted by these philanthrocapitalists pretty much demand that the recipients adopt their worldview to a greater or lesser extent. So essentially, if you are a university and you are wanting some money to, do research or whatever the project is, these philanthrocapitalists will, bestow their largesse onto you, but they will also set some rules about what you're allowed to study and what you're not allowed to study and what your conclusions can be and what they're not allowed to be. We see this a lot with the pharmaceutical industry, not really allowed to publish any research that casts them in a negative light. So in this way, philanthrocapitalism is like a soft power that is used to gradually reshape institutions from the inside out. And that's what JDR was able to do with medical education. He used his donations to um, to encourage the recipients, these elite universities, to adopt the model that was outlined in the Flexner Report. And these elite institutions like Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and Columbia were recipients of that largesse. They, of course, adopted this new model and they became the centers of influence in modern medical education. And that is an enduring legacy. They continue to be sort of the quintessential places to study medicine to this day. So, in order to completely reshape medical education, of course, JDR had to get in and, essentially rewrite the curricula and the textbooks. So that's what ended up happening. Traditional and holistic practices were excluded from the curricula and textbooks of these medical schools, except, to be branded as being pseudoscience. And then the pharma-based model of medicine became the focus of instruction. So it's sort of the pill for all ills model. It's still taught today. I mean no disrespect when I say this, but today, the way that physicians and medical professionals are trained is that they make a diagnosis and then they reach for their prescription pad to write a prescription for the most quote unquote appropriate pharmacological intervention that is going to suppress the symptoms of the condition that their patient is reporting with. So it's a really great model if you are in the fossil fuel industry and therefore making money off the sales of pharmaceuticals. Arguably, maybe not such a great model with regard to public health and patient health outcomes. Okay, so this is where things get kind of fun. One of the most consequential long-term outcomes of the shift towards the more industrialized model of medicine was the birth of the medical industrial complex. And this is an interesting backstory here. The historical context, I think, is really relevant and interesting because the medical industrial complex actually sprang directly from the military industrial complex. So I want to break that history down just real briefly here. And it begins with World War II. During this time, the United States government was funneling lots and lots of money into science, technology, and industry for supporting the war effort. So this is essentially what gave rise to the military industrial complex, because now corporate capitalism was married to the waging of war. And so war became profitable for these industries. So after the war ended, these powerful industries lost their primary revenue stream, and so they were repurposed wholesale for the service of medicine. So I want to kind of pause and reflect on the energetics that are implied here. We have these industries that were supporting war, i.e. murder, and then they are repurposed for the service of medicine. So murder to medicine, that feels a little dicey to me. And that's not just me sort of like pontificating and some sort of woo-woo sense that I get about this being dark. I can give you a concrete example. So Bayer is, of course, a really powerful pharmaceutical corporation. They also got into the business of agrochemicals when they acquired Monsanto. Back in the 1940s, Bayer merged with the German chemical conglomerate IG Farben. And IG Farben has a pretty terrible, notorious reputation because this corporation was very closely aligned with the Nazi regime. So closely aligned, in fact, that they were charged with crimes, charged and convicted of crimes against humanity and war crimes after World War II in the Nuremberg trials because they were profiting off of slave labor. They were providing the pesticides that were used in gas chambers to commit mass murder. And then, more specifically, to the Bayer arm of IG Farben, they were convicted of testing pharmaceutical drugs on unwilling human subjects, specifically in Auschwitz. So, this is some really dark stuff that this corporate conglomerate was engaged in, all in the name of making money, all in the name of profit. So, after the war ended and IG Farben was charged and convicted of these crimes, Bayer ended up distancing itself, obviously, and became its own corporate entity again. But the same infrastructure, personnel, and leadership that was complicit in war crimes was again repurposed for providing medical care to the people of this country. So, just a little bit of editorializing here. I believe in rehabilitation and redemption for, I would say, most humans, perhaps not all. But I certainly would not extend that courtesy to corporations because they don't have a body to incarcerate or a soul to save. And if these corporations are willing to commit war crimes in the name of generating profit, then perhaps they are not the people that we should be trusting with purveying our healthcare. Just my 2 cents. Okay, so that's the history. Now we want to focus on some of the key features of the medical industrial complex. And of course, at the center of this is the pharmaceutical industry and the massive amount of power and influence that the pharmaceutical industry has in this medical industrial complex is primarily thanks to John D. Rockefeller because he managed to successfully link the practice of medicine and the fossil fuel industry economically. So now they're tied together. And this is why we see the synthetic, patentable, and petroleum-based drugs replace all the natural remedies that were used in traditional medicine. So another key component of the medical industrial complex is this idea of corporate medicine. And this is the predictable outcome of merging corporate capitalism with medicine, just like merging, war in the military with corporate capitalism. You get some kind of a Frankenstein monster. And so what we have now in this country is, of course, a centralized healthcare system that is absolutely dominated by corporate entities. So it's layer upon layer of corporate interests that are involved in the healthcare system here. We have pharma, of course, but we also have the insurance industry, lab and diagnostics, medical equipment, admin. So there are just a lot of corporate fingers in this healthcare pie. So, one of the main issues with corporate medicine is, of course, that it is inherently focused on profits, which means that it's not focused on patient health outcomes. You can't have it both ways. So, medical decisions, whether practitioners are aware of it or not, are kind of like built in. It's built into the system that medical decisions are going to be driven by profit motives and not necessarily by patient well-being. So this is why we see the treatment of chronic disease being incentivized because that represents a long-term revenue stream for these corporations. And this isn't anything like, super insightful. It's been said a million times before, but I think it deserves repeating. And that is that in a for-profit healthcare system, cures and prevention are not good for business, and healthy people make terrible customers. So when we state it this way, real plainly, it becomes super clear that there's just an inherent ethical misalignment in a for-profit medical system. It's essentially a zero-sum game, right? Both sides cannot win, and I think it's pretty clear which side is winning when we reflect on where we're at with our healthcare system today. I'm always a big fan of quotes, so I've got a couple of quotes here that I think are really great at encapsulating, what we're dealing with our current healthcare system. This first one comes from excuse me, Dr. Relman, who is a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. So I think he's quite qualified to make these kinds of statements. And he said the medical profession is being bought by the pharmaceutical industry, not only in terms of the practice of medicine, but also in terms of teaching and research. And this is, yeah, I think that really says a lot because, as I said before, it's, medical practitioners and physicians aren't, I think, you know, performing in an unethical way or acting in an unethical way. They've just been sort of indoctrinated into this system because this is the way that medicine is taught. He continues, the academic institutions of this country are allowing themselves to be the paid agents of the pharmaceutical industry. That certainly was my experience in pharmacy school. The second one comes from an anonymous former pharma executive. And this person said there's no money in healthy people and there's no money in dead people. The money is in the chronically ill. And there are a lot of chronically ill people in this country. So there's a lot of money being made. Okay, so we are about 100 years plus or minus into this new paradigm. So I think it's an appropriate time to sort of pause and reflect on that question of like, is this still serving us? And what have the outcomes of this new paradigm been? So the outcomes have been pretty positive for some of the folks whose logos are posted here. But I wonder, not wonder, I have answers. I want to discuss how this new medical paradigm has affected the people. So, as always, there's good news and there's bad news. So, we'll start with the good news. I'm all about giving credit where it is due, even if sometimes I have to do that a little bit reluctantly. But it is certainly a valid point to say that when it comes to acute medicine and trauma care, the biomedical, like science-based approach to medicine is absolutely miraculous. It is unparalleled. It is accomplishing things that traditional medicine practices certainly could not have been able to do. If you are having a heart attack or you have a sucking chest wound, you want to be in the hallowed halls of one of these elite university teaching hospitals with a team of medical professionals who are trained in this model because they will very likely save your life. Um, we also have these incredible surgical capabilities now where, if you need to reset a bone or you need a tumor resected, like that can be done. It's pretty amazing. Um, there are a few classes of pharmaceuticals that I personally would agree are life-saving and life-enhancing when they're used appropriately, which is a super important caveat. So things like antibiotics, insulin, anesthesia, and pain meds, anticoagulants, and corticosteroids are very valuable, again, when used appropriately, which a lot of times they aren't. And then this biomedical model coupled with technology has given us the gift of some pretty incredible diagnostic tools that provide us useful data in terms of imaging in labs, very useful for making diagnoses and sometimes in the treatment of conditions. Now, on to the bad news. And this kind of relates to everything outside of acute care and trauma medicine. I want to deliver the bad news with some for me, pretty disturbing statistics here. So, the United States is ranked about 50th in life expectancy among other wealthy nations. So that's, not a great number. We spend about 2 times per capita on healthcare with objectively worse outcomes. I would say we're pushing up on 3 times. Um, per capita, the amount spent, because as we all know, healthcare is not getting cheaper. This next one is really grim for me. Only 12% of adults are considered metabolically healthy. That is coming up real hard on single digits. Um, Over 70% of Americans are overweight, about 40% are obese. 3/4 of Americans have at least one chronic disease, which I just think is so upsetting. Um, about half of Americans take at least one prescription medication chronically, and about 37% take 5 or more. This is polypharmacy. This is, one of those things that was so upsetting for me about being a pharmacist. Once you enter into the realm of polypharmacy, things get real hairy real fast. The United States represents about 5% of the global population, and yet we fund about 75% of global pharma profits. So we are literally paying for these pretty abysmal health outcomes. So I want to take a minute to state explicitly that I don't believe that the biomedical approach to medicine is in and of itself the problem. I think it's been much more about the implementation of this medical model because as we've discussed from the very beginning, it was all about this, corporate interest, profit-driven setup. And then as, all of you folks in the alternative healthcare space are aware, the the dominant paradigm is that alternative therapies are just, kind of derided and dismissed, and they're certainly not covered by insurance. And so what we've essentially ended up with is a system that manages symptoms for profit instead of addressing root cause for healing. I want to take a minute to talk about this topic of iatrogenesis because I don't think that it gets enough attention, and it really ought to, in my opinion. So, iatrogenesis is essentially just a really big word that refers to any time medical treatment or intervention causes harm, so injury or death. And iatrogenesis includes a lot of circumstances like medical errors, adverse drug reactions, unnecessary surgeries, hospital infections, malnutrition, and other complications that are related to medical interventions. So when we look at these numbers, we are confronted with a pretty sobering reality, and that is the fact that the medical system in this country is itself a leading cause of death. So I have some data to back that up. In 2022, the FDA released its adverse event reporting system data, which showed that there were 175,000 fatalities that year that were linked directly to drugs that were taken as prescribed. So these weren't overdoses, and these weren't people who were taking their medications inappropriately. These were people who were taking their meds exactly as their doctor told them to. So, pharmaceuticals are pretty dangerous. I think that's a safe thing for me to assert. In 2016, Johns Hopkins did a study that showed that iatrogenesis was the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer, killing about 250,000 people a year. And then way back in 2003, a book was published called Death by Medicine that was written by a number of researchers and physicians that ranked iatrogenesis as the number one leading cause of death, killing 784,000 people a year. That number is so much larger than the Johns Hopkins study because they were more liberal in what they included in that count. They were looking at all of those types of iatrogenesis that are listed in the first bullet point there. I also want to state here, and this is really important to keep in mind, is that as grim as this data is, these numbers are severely underreported. And that's not coming from me, that's coming directly from the FDA that admits that less than 10% of adverse drug reactions end up getting reported formally. So, as upsetting as these numbers are, they don't even come close to illustrating how bad this situation is. Okay, so as a food is medicine person, I cannot help myself. We have to take a little bit of time to talk about this topic of how food shifted from medicine to becoming a product of industry. This shift towards an industrial model of our food systems happened in parallel to the industrialization of medicine. So, not surprisingly, Standard Oil's greasy fingerprints are all over this one as well, because Rockefeller was also able to successfully economically link agriculture to the fossil fuel industry. And this is what led to the rise of the corporate, chemical, and technological model of farming that dominates global food systems today. So this has been exported across the planet. So this story is very similar to the story of industrialized medicine, not surprisingly, same players, same kind of storyline. So post-World War II, those same wartime industries that were repurposed for the service of medicine were also repurposed for the service of industrialized agriculture. And again, there's some dark energetics there. I'll give you some examples. Ammonium nitrate was primarily used during wartime to make explosives. After the war ended, ammonium nitrate became one of the principal ingredients in synthetic fertilizers. Nerve agents like sarin gas were the inspiration for the organophosphate pesticides. And then again, similarly, the waste products of oil refining were also repurposed for agrochemicals, but not just agrochemicals, but also ingredients that are added directly to the food supply, like preservatives and artificial food dyes. Every single artificial food dye is a petroleum derivative. And again, that's added to ultra processed foods. So it becomes pretty clear to me, at least, that our industrial food system was never built upon any kind of nutritional principles, but rather, once again, it was all about industry profit. And of course, this has had a very significant negative effect on public health. So again, another similarity, we have the corporate medical model. We also have a corporate food monopoly in this country where there are about five corporations that control the food supply from seed to shelf. So every aspect of it. So they're producing agrochemicals, farming machinery, they're handling food processing, food additives, distribution, and packaging. So one of the main issues or one of the main issues with an industrial food system and this corporate model is that industrial agriculture relies almost entirely on cheap, high yield commodity crops. So in this country, it's the big three: corn, soy, and wheat. Corn and soy are, of course, genetically modified. So thank you so much, Bayer. And then wheat has its own set of issues. There's the blood sugar element of it, which I won't get into, but I want to mention that another major issue with wheat, especially that which is cultivated in this country, is that there's this practice now where wheat producers on this industrial scale will spray glyphosate or Roundup directly onto wheat about 2 weeks before it's harvested. It's used as a desiccant because it essentially kills the wheat crop and then it dries consistently, and the industry experiences less product loss. And the issue here, one of the primary issues, is that the mechanism of action of glyphosate is that of a broad spectrum antibiotic. So every time somebody eats wheat that is conventionally cultivated in this country, they're getting a dose of antibiotics, which is absolutely devastating to the gut microbiome and human health and planetary health and all the rest. Um, so another issue with this industrial model of our food system is that small scale producers pretty much can't compete and they get squashed. And that has led ultimately to a plummeting in whole food diversity that is available to people in this country. We humans evolved to eat hundreds of different edible plants, but in this country now we're down to about 15, and the vast majority of those are consumed in their ultra processed forms. And then one other thing I want to share that's I find to be pretty alarming is that 80% of the farm acreage in this country is devoted to the cultivation of these three commodity crops. And the vast majority of those crop yields are not used to feed humans, but rather to support factory farming, industrial animal agriculture, which is just an abhorrent and disgusting practice. And then it's also used for industrial uses like biofuels, i.e., ethanol. So, stated another way, 80% of the farm acreage in this country isn't even being used to feed humans. So, what we've ended up here with is a profit-driven feedback loop where our industrial food system causes illness, and then the medical industrial complex is there to treat those illnesses, and these industries end up profiting on both sides. So, pretty dark. Okay, I want to switch gears now. I want to move us from the darkness into the light. Um, and so, in summary, what we've talked about is the way that these industrialists use their money and their influence to really deeply root the story of modern medicine into the structural systems of this country. But they also managed at the same time to really effectively reinforce the broader materialist myths about who we are and what we're capable of, essentially. And the story that we're being sold by this model is a pretty disempowering one, especially with regard to health and medicine, because essentially the message is if modern medicine can't fix you, then you are out of luck. So you can learn how to live with your condition and the side effects of the pharmaceuticals that you will be taking for the rest of your life, or worst case scenario, you go home and you get your affairs in order. So, in my opinion, the positive thing here is that the current paradigm is really beginning to strain under the weight of mounting evidence that is coming to us through these amazing emerging frontier sciences like psychoneuroimmunology and systems biology and the science of the microbiome, and kind of everything quantum is telling us a very different story that is far more empowering. So even though the evidence is mounting and this new paradigm is really starting to come into form, it certainly is not a widely discussed or accepted model. And it's definitely not what's being taught in mainstream academic institutions. And that makes a lot of sense because, paradigm shifts don't happen rapidly. Science advances one funeral at a time. And in the case of new perspectives on health and medicine, this is going to take a minute. It's going to be a protracted process because this new story that's coming to us from these frontier sciences is directly challenging the assumptions upon which some of the most powerful systems and industries have been built. So this old paradigm is certainly not going to go quietly into the night when there's so much financial interest in keeping it afloat. So, on a more heartening note, I have this quote from Buckminster Fuller that I really like. That is, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I think that's kind of exactly what's happening with these frontier sciences. I think they're offering us the possibility of a new model that will allow us to leave this old one behind, which I consider to be a good thing. So for the rest of the time that we have together, I want to do a side-by-side comparison of these competing paradigms. So we'll look at the dominant status quo story that we're living in right now, and we'll contrast that to these alternative stories that are coming to us through these emerging sciences. And I like this part. I consider it to be like the light part because these alternative stories are far more empowering and they're providing a lot of evidence that's pointing to the fact that we have this innate healing capacity, this inner healing wisdom and intelligence, and that we as individuals and collectively as a society have a great deal of agency to support that inner intelligence. So I want to start by looking at the competing paradigms of classical Newtonian biology versus quantum biology. So our current model of classic Newtonian biology tells us that the body is a machine that is made of separate and disparate parts that are operating in isolation from one another and from the environment. And this, very materialist approach is all about reductionism. And so there's this idea that we can unlock the secrets of life and our biology if we just break things into smaller and smaller parts. And this is reflected in the fact that in our medical system, we have so many specialties and subspecialties, neurology, cardiology, immunology, psychology. And I think ultimately what this is showing us is there is a lack of sort of holistic understanding. This model supposes that there is a linear causality or a direct cause and effect relationship that governs all aspects of biology, all biological processes. So, stated another way, that's the idea that if you make a change in A, you're going to get a specific and predictable change in B. And this is kind of the whole premise of pharmacological interventions. You create this drug that's supposed to target this one receptor that will elicit a change in the target organ. And then all of the other changes that happen in the body are considered side effects, when really and truly they're still part of the direct effect of the drug. So, health, according to this model, is about fixing broken parts with your typical Western medical interventions of drugs or surgery. And the message, therefore, that we're being given is that we as humans are passive bystanders in our health with regard to our health, and we're dependent on external experts to fix our malfunctions in order for us to heal. The alternative story here is that of quantum biology. And in this model, the body is viewed as a holistic and interconnected system. So the body, the mind, and the environment are all in this constant relationship, and they're operating essentially as an inseparable and interactive whole. The boundaries between self and other sort of begin to dissolve in this model, and it becomes more of just this unified field of interaction. This model supposes that there is a nonlinear causality that governs biological processes. So if you were to make a change in A, what you would get is a widespread and unpredictable effect that ripples throughout the entire system or the whole organism. Healing, according to this model, is about restoring internal balance and coherence within the organism. So, coherence in this context is about the orderly and synchronized alignment of the various aspects of the system or the various parts so that it allows for a harmonious and free flow of information and energy throughout the system. The message of this model is that the body, rather than being a machine, is a dynamic and intelligent and self-regulating system that is entirely enmeshed in its environment, which means that it is also affected by its environment. And that is both the external and the internal environment that has an effect. I think the quantum biology model is superior in a lot of ways, but I think one of the most intriguing ways is that it offers us a framework to understand the things that Newtonian biology can't explain, specifically the idea of medical anomalies. Um, they are acknowledged as phenomena that occur, within the context of Newtonian biology, but they are not focused on. They're kind of just considered outliers. And, there's a shrugging of the shoulders essentially because this model can't explain it. But the quantum biology model actually makes space for understanding those phenomena. Okay, on to the contrast of genetic determinism versus environmental determinism. So, our current paradigm is that of genetic determinism, which tells us that our DNA acts as our master blueprint. It is the thing that controls all aspects of our biology. So, not just our physical attributes, but our personality traits, as well as our susceptibility to disease, is all encoded in our DNA. There's this sort of idea that's known as the central dogma of biology, which is really kind of a core principle of genetic determinism. And that suggests that there is a very rigid and inescapable one-way flow of genetic information through biological systems. And it goes from DNA to RNA to protein. So in this central dogma, it's DNA that is basically containing all of the instructions, and there's really no breaking free from that according to this model. I just want to point out that one of the biggest pitfalls of genetic determinism is that it overlooks and pretty much completely dismisses the role that environment plays in determining our health outcomes. So, healing, according to this model, is about managing your inherited defects through your typical medical interventions, drugs, and surgery. And the message there is that there's a primacy of DNA and our genes in terms of dictating this kind of, or wielding this authority over who we are and what we will become. So, our genes are essentially seen as our destiny, and they behave as a fixed and unchangeable variable. And so there's this idea of like a biological inevitability. And this perspective, this worldview is very fatalistic and disempowering, I think, even on its surface, because what it tells us is that the die is cast at birth, and you're either a winner or a loser in the genetic lottery, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. I guess just, thank your parents for what they gave you. The alternative story here is that of environmental determinism, and this views the environment as essentially an architect that plays a very significant role in shaping the way our biology expresses itself. So, this framework of environmental determinism is supported by the science of epigenetics, and epigenetics explains how the environment is able to affect gene expression. So, how it affects which genes get turned on and which ones get turned off. So, what epigenetics is showing us is that gene expression is, in fact, not a fixed and unchangeable variable, but it is rather very dynamic and responsive to the conditions of our environment. Again, both external and internal inputs. So, healing, according to this model, is about cultivating the environmental conditions that will support health. And the message then is that there is a primacy of environment rather than DNA and genes. And this suggests that we have a great deal of biological adaptability, meaning that we have a lot of agency in our biological destiny because how we live shapes how our biology expresses itself ultimately. So the body is not ruled by this static code of DNA, but the body is rather this living and highly responsive system that is informed by those environmental inputs. So if you optimize your environment, then you can make the argument that you could delay, prevent, and sometimes even reverse disease, even in people who are considered genetically predisposed. And there are a number of studies that support this idea, showing that a healthy diet, exercise, meditation, and having a strong social support system can all play a really significant role in how your biology expresses itself in terms of which genes get turned on and which ones get turned off. Okay, moving on to the germ theory versus the terrain theory. This set of paradigms has me kind of entranced. I find it so fascinating, not just because of the content of both of these theories, but because of the history and the story of how they came to be. Both the germ theory and the terrain theory were developed concurrently at the same time by two French researchers. Interestingly enough, they were both Frenchmen. The first one, of course, germ theory. Everyone's heard of Pasteur. His name is, it's a household name, essentially. But almost nobody has heard of the man who developed the terrain theory. His name was Antoine Béchamp. And so from a historical perspective, I really like this topic because I feel like it's another really great example of how politics and profit play a huge role in determining which ideas get accepted and institutionalized and which ones get dismissed and ignored and kind of relegated to the shadows of history. So, getting into it a little bit more deeply here, the germ theory, our current model, tells us that external microbes invade the human body and they cause infectious disease. So, in this model, microbes are the primary and direct cause of infectious disease. So, it's about whether or not you're exposed to them, it's their presence or absence that determines your health. And so, the body is seen as essentially this passive host that is vulnerable to attack by these foreign entities. So, healing according to this model is all about eradicating microbes. And therefore, the message is with greater sterility comes greater health. So again, I am all about giving credit where it's due. The germ theory is largely responsible for some major advances that have been made in terms of hygiene and sanitation practices. And then antibiotics kind of spring from this worldview, and they also sort of reinforce an aspect of the validity of this perspective. But because the germ theory has been so, I would say, overly enthusiastically embraced and implemented, there's like massive amount of sort of certainty and zeal around this theory. It has led to a lot of unintended consequences. So primary among them is the indiscriminate and, excessive use of antibiotics. Associated with that is this sort of fear of microbes that's been ingrained into all of us, especially in the Western world. We have this obsession with sterility, and there is evidence that obsession with sterility has actually led to a dysfunction in the immune system. The Western world, generally, the population has a greater incidence of asthma and allergies, which is a sign of an imbalanced immune system. So it has had some adverse effects on our immunity. And then at a systems level, this all out sort of attack on all microbial life has led to some very significant ecological imbalances that are very problematic, not just for human health, but for planetary health. So the alternative story here, I want to say one more thing about the germ theory. What we're able to sort of reflect on now, hundreds of years since the germ theory was first developed, is that ultimately this theory is oversimplified and it's also outdated. So since the 18th century, believe it or not, a lot of new information has come in that is showing us that there is a much more complex, nuanced, and vital role that microorganisms play in our health. And so that brings me to the terrain theory, which tells us that it is the state of the body's internal terrain or its internal environment that ultimately determines an individual's susceptibility to succumbing to an infectious disease. So this model, it has the perspective more that illness is arising when the body's terrain is weakened or compromised, and that microbes are not the primary cause of infectious disease, that they're not actually inherently pathogenic. So healing, according to this model, is all about supporting the overall resilience of the host. So these are all of the practices that we're all very familiar with. If you want to tend to your internal terrain, you look at your nutrition, you look at your detoxification system, you manage your stress, all those things that help keep us healthy and resilient are really the message here in how to heal, according to the terrain theory. So the idea that's being expressed here by the terrain theory is that health is determined by the state of the internal terrain and not by the presence of germs in and of themselves. So again, a weakened terrain is what allows these microorganisms to act in a way that is opportunistic And when we have a balanced internal ecosystem, then natural resistance to infection is what organically arises. And microbes in this model are seen as essential cohabitants whose behavior is really just a reflection of the habitat that they find themselves in. So a microorganism can act in a beneficial way depending on what's going on in our internal environment, or if things are out of balance with that internal terrain, they can begin to act in a way that is more opportunistic and can lead to disease. So this perspective aligns a lot more nicely with the information that's coming from the microbiome science, which is oh so fascinating. I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about it because I just think it's so fascinating. So when we talk about the microbiome, we can think about this as essentially the ecosystem that resides within us. Um, when you look at the number of cells that are in and on the human body, you'll find that 90% of them, give or take, are microbial, and only 10% of those cells are human. So we are 10% human based on this metric. Gets even weirder when we look at genes because then we're outnumbered like 360 to 1, which means that there is 360 times the amount of genetic information that is microbial in origin versus human in origin. So for me, when I look at these numbers, I'm like, okay, I think it's accurate to say that we humans are hybrid creatures that are genetically less than 1% human. That has all sorts of weird philosophical implications from where I'm sitting in terms of like who's steering the ship. What about autonomy? Like what's actually going on? Perhaps we're not as autonomous and independent as we would like to believe that we are. Another way of looking at this is that we humans are these really sophisticated carrying cases for this complex microorganism ecosystem that resides within us. So, all higher life forms are the descendants of microbes. They were here long before us, they will be here long after. And so, we necessarily ended up co evolving right alongside them. And so, we have developed a very deeply symbiotic relationship with microorganisms. It could be so deeply connected that that relationship even exists on a cellular level. There's this theory called the endosymbiotic theory that posits that our mitochondria, the organelles in all of our cells that produce energy, could actually be ancient bacteria that entered into a symbiotic relationship with early eukaryotic cells. So we could be that deeply connected with microorganisms. And then that symbiotic relationship is even further evidenced by the various vital roles that our microbes play in our general health. So, just to name a few of those roles, our microorganisms that live in our gut and our large intestine are what are actually capable of digesting plant fiber and resistant starches. We can't do that. It's our microorganisms that are digesting those plant materials. Our gut microbes are largely responsible for training our immune system to learn how to identify and tolerate our commensal bacteria, the quote unquote beneficial bacteria that we should have in our gut, and to identify the microorganisms that could potentially cause imbalance in that system. So those are targeted. Um, our microbes also can produce a lot of or several nutrients and vitamins. So specifically, our gut microbes can make vitamin B12, vitamin K2. They also produce short chain fatty acids, which are responsible for fueling our the cells in our gut lining. And then ultimately, our microbiome and our gut microbes are our primary line of defense and protection against infection, which again is an imbalance in that ecosystem. So, as opposed to what we're being told by the germ theory, what the microbiome science is telling us is that diversity and balance are key and that our health is inseparable and completely dependent upon our microbial community. And it is the loss of that diversity that really ends up undermining our health. So it's not about eradicating microbes, it's about having a healthy, balanced ecosystem of microorganisms. Okay, moving on to the mind and the body. Our current story is still very much rooted in this idea of the mind-body dualism. So this is the oh so enduring echo of the Cartesian mechanistic way of thinking. I think it was back in the early 1600s that Rene Descartes famously split the body from the mind. And that is still the way that, the body and the mind are conceived of in the current medical model. And this is illustrated by the fact that still psychological and physiological processes are considered independent from one another. And again, this is represented in this sort of fragmentation of care where physical and mental illnesses are, for the most part, treated in isolation. You have the siloed specialties where, psychiatrists and psychologists don't really know much about gastroenterology. Gastroenterologists don't know much about human psychology. And so, again, this is kind of a reflection of that lack of holistic understanding. So, healing according to mind body dualism is about fixing the body and ignoring any emotional or psychological factors that may be at play. And this is a vice versa kind of situation. It plays both ways. And then the message that we're being delivered is that our mental and emotional states don't affect our physical health, and our physical health doesn't necessarily affect our mental or emotional states. So they're just operating independently from one another according to this model. The alternative story, of course, is the reunification of the mind and the body. I think the mind body connection is pretty broadly accepted by most people, which I find really interesting because that has not been reflected in the way that medicine is practiced. Um, so the mind and the body are completely interdependent. They're continuously interacting with one another. And this isn't speculation. This is this is fact. There's a lot of empirical evidence to support this idea that what happens in the mind does not stay in the mind. Our mental and our emotional states are actually biologically active states. And essentially, all of our thoughts are alchemized or transmuted into chemistry that affects our physiology. This is kind of exemplified by the idea of the gut brain or the heart brain. But we could go even deeper and get like trippier by recognizing that there's also a cell brain connection. And the way that this works is that all of our thoughts are generally associated with some sort of emotion, be them intense or not so intense. There's a link there between thought and emotion. And emotions will produce chemical messengers that are biologically active and will elicit a cellular response. So when you think about it this way, and this is where it gets really psychedelic and trippy for me, every single cell in our body is actually listening to every single thought that we have. So, all the more reason to sort of become conscious of our unconscious thoughts because our body is listening. Healing, according to this model, is about addressing the physical, emotional, and mental factors that are happening with an individual in order to bring them into a better state of balance. And the message here is that the mind has a profound influence on our physical health. And again, vice versa. These two are connected. So I want to go just a little bit deeper into this topic of the mind-body connection, because I think it just gets so fascinating. Um, so I've stolen the title of this slide from a book of the same title by Bruce Lipton, which, if you haven't read The Biology of Belief, I highly recommend it. It is pretty mind-blowing, paradigm-shifting stuff. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm categorizing the placebo effect and spontaneous remission as aspects of the biology of belief. So first, we'll look at the placebo effect, which is, of course, when an inert treatment, like a sugar pill or a sham surgery, ends up producing real and measurable physiological effects that move an individual towards greater health and balance. So essentially what's happening with the placebo effect is our thoughts, our emotions, and our expectations are what are actually eliciting and catalyzing the physiological response. This really highlights how powerful the mind is. Um, you could make an argument that the placebo effect is far more powerful than what conventional wisdom would suggest. There's evidence that suggests that the placebo effect could account for between 30 and 60% of perceived treatment benefits, depending on the condition that's being treated. And there was actually a meta-analysis done where 35 drug trials that were submitted to the FDA for SSRI, excuse me, SSRI treatment. This meta-analysis showed that up to 82% of the perceived treatment benefits could be attributed to the placebo effect. 82%. That's crazy to me. And then it's also worth mentioning that there are no side effects to the placebo effect, which is not a claim that can be made for SSRIs. They're actually pretty dangerous for a lot of people, very complicated. Not that they don't help some people, but then you could make the argument how much of that is the SSRI and how much of that is actually the placebo effect. So pharma, of course, treats the placebo effect as noise that needs to be controlled. It's essentially a nuisance. And this makes perfect sense because again, the sole purpose of the pharmaceutical industry is to make profits, and understanding the power that the mind has to heal the body is potentially really terrible for business. So that's how the placebo effect is essentially treated in our current medical model. The nocebo effect is essentially the shadow side of the placebo effect, and this is where negative beliefs or warnings that are given to a patient from their provider could actually worsen their symptoms, their conditions, or could lead to new side effects. So this is seen really commonly with patients who have cancer and are going to receive chemotherapy. If they're told that their particular cocktail can cause severe nausea, a lot of times these people report that they get nauseated in the car on the way to their very first visit before they even receive their chemotherapy. So it's like an anticipatory arising of symptoms. I want to take a second to talk about medical hexing because this is one of those things that kind of makes me worked up and angry. I'll just admit that. I consider medical hexing to be one of the most insidious aspects of the nocebo effect, primarily because it's such a systemic aspect of the way that medicine is practiced these days. So, medical hexing is essentially when a negative prognosis becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for a patient. And this makes perfect sense to me. I'm sure a lot of people have had this experience or they have loved ones that have had the experience of going to the doctor and you get a really scary diagnosis, and that's followed by an even more disturbing prognosis. You have cancer, 6 months to live. This understandably will knock a lot of people right out of their parasympathetic, relaxed and balanced state into a state of chronic fear and stress, into sympathetic overdrive. And when we are in that side of the nervous system, our immunity is suppressed. We are not able to fully express our regenerative capacities. It can be a massive blow to our mental resilience. And a lot of times it shakes the faith in a person's ideas around their ability to heal. So it can be really damaging. It is. It's like a curse. And I think the main issue I have with medical hexing is that, from my perspective, it's ultimately just a failure of imagination and even humility on the part of the medical system and sometimes even the practitioner themselves who are delivering this news. And it's always disguised as some sort of clinical expertise. So it's kind of akin to medical gaslighting in a lot of ways. And this is kind of the take-home message for me with regard to medical hexing. That is that the medical system's inability, or sometimes its unwillingness, to cure a condition does not equate to the body's inability to heal. Those are two very different things. And I think that's kind of the take-home that I want to impart here. Moving on to spontaneous remission. This is, of course, when an individual experiences an unexpected recovery, complete resolution of their symptoms or condition without conventional treatment, or really any time that a person's healing defies conventional understanding. So, with regard to the mind-body connection, there are some common characteristics that people who have experienced spontaneous remissions have reported. Among them is that a lot of these people have like a shift in their attitude and their perspective. So they develop a different relationship with their diagnosis. A lot of times people will have a renewed sense of purpose because when you're faced with your mortality in that kind of way, you start to take stock and inventory of your life. And a lot of times people come to, really healing conclusions about what their purpose is in life. Gratitude is a really common theme. People focus more on the things that they do have rather than, the fear associated with their diagnosis. And then ultimately, these folks report that they had developed a very deep trust in their body's ability to heal. So, what this tells us essentially is that the body is capable of self-correcting under the right conditions, and that our inner healer is very powerfully activated through these kinds of mental shifts. And the mind plays a really profound role in physical transformation. So, the message that we're being imparted here through this idea of the biology of belief is that in order to heal your body, you must also heal your mind. Okay, so this is the last set of paradigms I want to sort of explore. And this final set is really more related to philosophy than it is to any sort of scientific theory. I am not a philosopher, very far from it, so I'm going to keep this very surface level. And I'm bringing it in because I feel like one of like the most foundational myths that a culture has is around the story that it tells itself about the nature of consciousness. So here in the Western materialist realm, the story that's being sold to us is that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain, meaning essentially that it's the brain that produces the mind or produces consciousness, and it's just a passive byproduct of this brain activity. And so, sort of following from that premise, it is assumed that that consciousness or the mind is entirely bound to the body and localized within the brain itself. And so then if the physical body and the brain die, then that should mean that that a person's consciousness and their mind ceases to exist. So the message that we're being given here is that the mind is just this, again, this epiphenomena. It is a passive byproduct that is just observing this objective and fixed reality. Consciousness essentially in this worldview has no effect on matter. And then to kind of extrapolate this idea into something more existential, what we're being told with this materialist narrative is that we essentially as humans are these isolated, powerless entities that are just passively witnessing, the world happening outside of us in this indifferent and cold mechanical universe. So that feels really like bleak and awful for me. It doesn't really resonate with me at all, this story. The alternative story, however, is that of one that views consciousness as a creative force. This is really kind of the central tenet in a lot of mystical traditions. And quantum science is finally starting to catch up to what the mystics have known for millennia, which is interesting. But consciousness in this worldview is seen as the fundamental ground of all reality. It is essentially the source of everything. And the brain in this model is not what produces consciousness, but rather it acts more as an antenna that is able to receive and interface with this ground of all reality, universal consciousness, the quantum field, whatever name we want to apply to it. So, based on these assumptions, we can state, according to this model, that consciousness and the mind are not, in fact, confined to the brain, but they are entirely non-local and extends well beyond the body, essentially being infinitely expansive in some understanding, right, in some way. This idea of consciousness not being confined to the brain is supported by pretty much every type of psi phenomena, telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, or remote viewing. If you haven't listened to the telepathy tapes, the podcast, I
Body
highly
still.
recommend.
Upper
What?
body still.
Yep,
Maybe
I
when the
highly
beach
recommend that you
pass.
do. It looks like Lorna, if you
Maybe
could
it's
mute
too high
yourself.
for you both.
We got some sound coming in. Thank you. Um, Yeah, so telepathy tapes, amazing, very convincing, very compelling. Telepathy seems to be a real thing. And then, what I also find is really funny is that we're told by a lot of, authorities on the matter that these psi phenomena are essentially, pseudoscience. But the CIA has been really interested in remote viewing for a very long time. So the CIA is taking this stuff very seriously. Just kind of as a side note. So the message here is ultimately that the mind is an active participant in the shaping of our reality. And this claim is supported again, like science catching up through the observer effect, which tells us that our attention and our energy actually affects how reality manifests itself and behaves. So, again, from an existential perspective, humans, according to this worldview, are co creators, and we are living in a conscious, intelligent, and arguably a loving universe, which for me feels a lot nicer to believe. I like that story far more. So, I want to close things here, first of all, by thanking you all for, accompanying me on this journey. And I want to leave you with what I hope is a thought-provoking rhetorical question here, which is what if we are far more powerful than we have been conditioned or even allowed to believe? I personally believe that this is the case. Um, And there's all this new evidence that's coming from these emerging sciences that I think ultimately is inviting us to expand our understanding of how reality really operates. And it's inviting us into this opportunity to reconsider what we believe to be true, what stories we want to tell ourselves about health, healing, and who we are as human beings. And again, when we understand the power of stories, then that often grants us the ability to step outside of the ones that we've been born into and begin to imagine and rewrite new ones that feel far more empowering with regard to who we truly are. So that's what I got. I know that, let me see, what time are we at? Yeah, so I mean, I've got 4 more minutes before um, the stated ending time here, but if y'all want to throw some questions at me, I'm happy to answer any that you may have. Or comments or, whatever. Or nothing is fine too.
I feel like I'm gonna have to like integrate this for a while, like little pieces by piece. I feel like you really brought that together at the end there and made me like hopeful. But I just love that thought of like how powerful we are and like are the stories that we're in paradigms we're living in actually supporting that.
Yeah, I thank you for that reflection. And I probably made this comment to some of you before, but I'll repeat it now. I used to say that I was really cynical, and now I'm realizing that I'm just able to sense the cynicism that exists in the world. And it's just unfortunate that, at least from my perspective, there is a lot of cynicism embedded in, all aspects of our lives. I could make that argument, but certainly in this medical paradigm where it's not an empowering one. It's not like, hey, we have the ability to heal ourselves. There's evidence that people have done exactly that. Um, and it makes a lot of sense as to why that's not been the narrative because it challenges or it puts into jeopardy these profit margins. So, and other power structures and all, it's all kind of built on the same sort of deception, I would say.
I think talking about the quantum theory of healing and biology is something too that every time I hear you talk about it, sort of like stirs this like um pulsation. I don't know how else to describe it.
Hmm.
Within me about like what is possible, and it's almost like overwhelming, right? Of the possibility that exists within our physical bodies and what exists around that. And it's exciting. I think taking little steps at a time. Hopefully, some of us out here are taking those little steps slowly and building these bridges between these models to, um, yeah, find a pathway and redefine it. But I really love when you bring that up, and it also stirs just this sort of like it's scary too, right? Like it's not contained.
Hmm.
And we don't have anything to sort of put it in a box yet or figure it all the way out.
Hmm.
But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a part of the mystery. And I think certainly in the Western world, we're trained to want to be able to explain and understand everything. And like, I just personally don't know that we're ever going to be able to. Like, we can experience it. But I think that's still kind of different than an intellectual knowing. It's a deeper kind of knowing. I I'm a deep believer in this quantum realm of healing because of some experiences that I've had um, in doing these Joe Dispenza retreats that I've done, where I have heard firsthand accounts of people healing themselves from stage 4 cancer and, being bound to a wheelchair because of their MS, like just through meditating, just through opening their heart and opening themselves to love. And this essentially this, I know it's woo-woo, but I think it's also really grounded in science, like opening themselves up to a higher frequency that, aligns or taps into this regenerative healing capacity. Um, it's yeah, it's very compelling stuff. Well, there's nothing else. We'll just
Okay.
wrap it. Thanks for letting me talk at you for a full hour and a half. It's
Thank
really
you.
fun for me. And people will let me rap to them about these things.
Well, we appreciate it for sure. So thank you so much. Uh, yeah,
At least 10 minutes.
we'll maybe see you next time.
Yeah,
You feeling frisky and want to put this much work into another talk. I can.
it's a pleasure. Yeah, I'll definitely come to you with more when I have it. Thank you for providing me with this platform consistently. It's so much fun for me. Thanks for coming, y'all.
Thank you, Stephanie. I always appreciate what you share. It's so thought-provoking. I really enjoy it.
Mission accomplished. Yay. Thank you for that feedback. All right, y'all. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and I hope to see you again real soon. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.